Today we have a very esteemed panel sitting before us, one of whom just got off of a plane from Taipei about 3 hours ago. And so she's going to be caffeinated while some of us may have other beverages soon to enjoy. So the topic today, as I said, is AI in government. And we are going to try to shape this as much as we can as to what is going on and then try to make it applicable to the deaf community and how we as a community can help to identify, resolve, and work on these problems as a group. So the first thing I'd like for each of you to do, I'm not going to introduce you, we could be witty about this like somebody was this morning, but I don't have that gene in me, so what I'd like you to do is to introduce yourself in 2 sentences and then tell me how AI makes you feel in a tweet. Mike, why don't you start?
All right, so Mike Kanaan, I'm the Air Force's cross-functional team co-chair for artificial intelligence at the Pentagon. So how does AI make me feel? I'm going to go after what Elsa had said earlier, tranquil, but also uncomfortable with the weight of the conversation itself.
I'm Bendett. I work at the Center for Naval Analysis on the Russia team. I look at the unmanned systems and AI applications and how the Russians are developing unmanned and AI, and I think AI makes me apprehensively optimistic.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Elsa Kania. Yeah, I'm with the.
Good morning, Elsa.
Oh dear. Good morning. There we go. Okay, off to a great start. Clearly. I'm Elsa Kania with the Center for Security and Emerging Technology as a research fellow, and I am the one who just got off the airplane, thus the coffee, and I suppose I'll blame this partly on the jet lag, but I suppose conversations about AI make me feel delirious and exhausted sometimes, for a variety of reasons.
Am I on? Hello. Hi. I'm Joanne Lo. I'm CEO of Elysian Labs. So AI makes me feel a little anxious, mostly because of the potential that it could bring and also the responsibilities on the people who are doing it. So, yeah.
I think this works. Does this work? No? Yes. I'm Jason Brown. I work emerging technology strategy for the U.S. Air Force and also represent the Air Force on the Joint AI Center. AI makes me feel tired a lot because it also makes me feel inspired at the same time. So it's kind of, you can't have one without the other.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to transition and we're going to give this question to Elsa first so that you can be awake, and then we'll go to Sam. And the reason why is because I'd really like for your opinions on what do you see are the most pressing threats to the United States in the national security space as it relates to AI. And you can relate that to your particular sphere of study, discussion, or projects that you're working on.
All right. So I worry that we don't yet appreciate the gravity of the competitive challenge. And I do think that China's aspirations to lead the world in AI do remain aspirational at this point. I don't see China as yet fully an AI superpower, but I think it is clear that innovation is at the heart of the PRC strategy for its economy and its military. And this has been a personal emphasis of Xi Jinping, who has declared under competitions of increasingly intense military competition, only the innovators will win. And folks who have been trying to study the Chinese military longer than I've been alive are sometimes skeptical that it can change and can innovate, and certainly there are a lot of obstacles there in terms of the Chinese military, like any bureaucracy or organization, trying to adapt to these challenges. But it is quite striking to see some of the transformations that are underway, and when I had a chance, for instance, to visit the Academy of Military Science this past summer, it was quite startling to me to hear that it's gone from being an institution that did strategy and doctrine to one where they have 2,000 strategists and 8,000 scientists, and the president is a lieutenant general who's known for his specialization in artificial intelligence and supercomputing. So when the Chinese military puts as the head of one of their premier organizations for military research someone who is an expert in AI, and when we hear that they are throwing ample resources behind it and trying to innovate and experiment with incorporating greater integration of theory and technology, developing new concepts of operations. That gets my attention. I will leave it there for now.
A lot of trends that Elsa described also apply to Russia. And also there's a lot of cooperation happening between Moscow and Beijing when it comes to high-tech, science, and now AI. And so, as Elsa mentioned, we have to start appreciating the challenge that this poses. In Russia specifically, there's a tremendous amount of innovation and experimentation taking place. We've seen Russian drive towards success in Syria and a lot of paths that they took to get there. There's a lot of experimentation in the MOD, in the Ministry of Defense. There's a lot of experimentation in the civilian agencies. And the state, the Russian state, is driving that innovation. And so that is something that we should be mindful, and we should certainly monitor what Russia is doing. But again, a lot of the trends that Elsa described also apply to Russia, and both countries are starting to inch towards closer scientific technical cooperation.
All right, and so for the three of you who are not specific to a country or region, what do you think that the United States needs to do in order to try to counter some of these threats that are posed for us today?
So I'll start with this. I think it's turning inward at the moment as opposed to focusing outwardly. Much of the time when we discuss these technologies, we're talking about the top 1% or saying, how will I ever find a machine learning engineer? When alternatively, we should probably be focusing on 99% of the country. So real focus in education, upskilling our workforce, reskilling the national workforce. And we've done this before. This is what happened after our Sputnik moment. We had a National Defense Education Act that helped inspire these things too. So a real whole of nation and a weighty effort back towards the citizens of our population in order to keep up with those realities.
I think the biggest threat is our procurement process and the incentives tied to it. It's created an incredible deep and wide valley of death that is incredibly difficult to bridge for a lot of different companies and organizations. We've seen a consolidation of the defense industry over the last 20 years. We've seen literally the research spending for the Defense Department cut in half from 17% of total spending to 8% since 2001, according to CRS. We've seen, when adjusted for inflation, about a 25% drop in research spending. So this emphasis on sustainment has led to a consolidation of the defense industry, and we have not participated in a way that I believe we would have had we not been with the innovation economy, had we not been at war for the last 20 years. So I think our own processes and our own culture that it drives that is frankly what we have to focus on. We have to figure out how to reliably and repeatedly bridge the valley of death.
Joanne?
So I completely agree with the procurement problem, with everything that you said. And one thing that I want to add to that is one problem with the procurement process is that a lot of times it looks at what somebody who is sitting at the office define as good, and then they give out money to do that. And even then, even if you're meeting those requirements, it's hard to get that money if you're a small company. When innovation, like we said, really comes from the edge, really comes from the tactical edge, really comes from people who are working the problem every day. And when those people come up with a technical solution or a solution of any kind, they're not usually very well supported. I understand that there are programs that support the tactical edge to come up with technical solutions, but those programs are not holistically widespread, and they should be, they need to be. So that's procurement problem number one. In terms of AI development, I do believe that so first of all, artificial intelligence means artificial intelligence, right? So the intelligence of the United States to create military power is different from China and Russia. So I am optimistic in that if we harness the right military power for the United States, I do believe that to be a powerful thing to harness, that we can compete with our near-peer adversaries. However, I think the biggest problem right now that we're facing is that we're not strategically aligning all the efforts within the United States. So that kind of goes back to what you were saying, which is there's a lot of AI or ML development efforts within the United States. So a lot of machine learning as well as narrow AI within the United States. And there's a lot of intelligence within the community, within the military community, that needs to be harnessed into artificial intelligence. But they're not properly put together. So that would be what I worry about, artificial intelligence in the United States.
So I'd like to build on what Joanne just talked about with the kind of the public-private partnerships that I think, Jobu, you kind of mentioned it, and that's a lot of what you were talking about too, Mike. And let's expand on that and maybe talk about what the implications are, both from an international perspective and from a US perspective, on how the Chinese, the Russians, and other countries are looking at public-private partnership within the AI, machine learning, data analytics, kind of this technology wave, and then how we're dealing with it within the United States. Does anybody want to start?
I can tackle the problem a little, or talk about the problem a little bit more, and I'm curious about what Russia and China are doing, you know, because I think they're doing some things very differently, right? So I talk about the Valley of Death. So we're doing a really good job, I think, over the last couple of years through various different venues and activities that we heard from Joey from AFWorks talk about how we are focused on bringing problems, those who own those problems, together with solution providers who are not your typical solution providers, right? And we're able to get to the point where we have some really good prototypes, really good MVPs, but we hit that Valley of Death. There isn't the incentive for program offices who are focused on sustainment to actually adopt and scale. So we're focused on an investment strategy at this point, and Joey mentioned this yesterday, which is how can we partner with venture capitalists? How can we, you know, do some different things with the SBIR program? The challenge, though, that we have with a lot of the big defense companies is, you know, they're very curious about, I'll say curious, you know, some of them I think have a different opinion, but they're very curious about how productive that's going to be. And we have to convince them that there's something in it for them, that this is a win-win for them, that working with small business and expanding the defense industrial base is a smart way of doing business, because there's so many, you know, great companies out there with great tech that we need, and we haven't figured out how to do that. I'm encouraged that we're doing some different things with investment strategy, and I think that our rivals, frankly, are ahead of us in that front.
To expand, but we don't live in an authoritarian regime, right? We just can't say commercial industry, traditional partners. You will partner with the Department of Defense. You will engage with us. So I think it's a translation gap. It's a communication thing that we have right now that we most need to address. I think too often in these conversations, we're largely talking above, past, below, through one another, when I think we're saying the same things. And it's about communication at this point and translating our values, translating our views of human dignity, translating what the Department of Defense already does with due diligence towards human rights and how we leverage these technologies. And there should be probably some renewed vigor in that conversation.
I think when it comes to Russian Federation, we have to view the phrase public-private partnership with a significant caveat, because the private sector as such in Russia is very small, is growing, and in many sectors it doesn't exist. What I'm saying is, it is the state, the Russian state, that funds a lot of projects, that supports a lot of projects. For example, Russia still doesn't have private universities like Harvard, like MIT, like others. All the top Russian schools are state-supported. So when we talk about public-private partnership, when we talk about what is going on in the Russian academia, in the industry, in the military, when it comes to AI, machine learning, or big data, we have to remember that it is the Russian state that stands behind most of these initiatives. In some sectors of the Russian economy, that's changing when it comes to IT writ large. But when it comes to AI and ML, it is the state. It is the Kremlin. And so all the processes that are taking place, all the initiatives, all the money, it's usually routed through state institutions. And we have to give Russians enough credit because they're trying to be flexible. They understand that the state cannot have a heavy role in innovation. But again, if all the money, if all the influence comes from the state, what does that do to the end product later on. So I think that's a very important distinction. I use the phrase public-private partnership when it comes to Russian AI development because it's an American phrase that we use here all the time. But I try to make that important caveat.
And I suppose I would say when it comes to China, there are attempts to create more of a hybrid model that combines state support, state direction, and state resourcing with the dynamism of Chinese commercial enterprises, which have varying degrees of involvement in supporting military research and weapons development. And Xi Jinping has declared that military civil fusion is a national strategy and imperative, and this concept essentially actually reflects in part lessons that China has learned from looking at the traditional successes of the integrated defense innovation ecosystem that the US has had, and looking at mechanisms like DARPA. China's Central Military Commission, Science and Technology Commission has been characterized as a would-be DARPA in that role in driving innovation and working with commercial enterprises. There's even what I would describe a little bit tongue-in-cheek as a perhaps a SCO or DIU with Chinese characteristics, a rapid innovation small group based in Shenzhen, which is a major center for drones and innovation in hardware that is trying to work, again, leveraging commercial technologies to support the Chinese military. So I'd say what I'm seeing in China is a lot of different initiatives launching, quite robust resourcing behind them, but it's too soon to tell how much of this will work out, and some of it may prove to be inefficient, but nonetheless effective on some fronts. So a lot of different guidance funds that are intended to hybridize between state support and venture capital. By some accounts, they aren't investing all that well, but some of these projects may pay off in the long term, and there are starting to be more small and medium enterprises that are specializing in working with the Chinese military on things like unmanned undersea vehicles, unmanned surface vehicles, essentially drone warships, along with simulations, cloud computing, and other forms of advanced computing, wargaming and simulation. So there's, although some of China's major national champions, so to speak, or the national team in AI, companies like Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, iFlyTech, and SenseTime at least publicly, are quiet about the extent to which they are working with the military and may have, in some cases, more limited involvement than some of their American counterparts. They are contributing to national laboratories and advancing strategic priorities. So I think we're seeing a lot of this still very much a work in progress. And ask me again in a couple of years where it ends up.
So first of all, I'm going to echo on your Valley of Death again. Because there is a lot of good work being done, and precisely what you're saying, which is it gets nowhere after it's MVP'd. And I am, as a small startup, I am personally very careful with getting investment from larger defense companies, simply because kind of harkens back to what we said about culture. When I started my company, I saw it as a chance to bring some positivity to the culture of defense contractors. And I did see something in bigger companies that I didn't like so much. So I came from Sandia National Labs, which was under Lockheed Martin. So I had some, dealings with bigger contractors. And after starting working with the DoD, I saw a lot of issues with working with larger contractors, and issues with even, program as record, things that are supposed to keep you safe, but eventually it ties back to the frozen middle problem, which I know we're not supposed to call it frozen middle, but let's just call it that for now. So I am a little careful about that. What I would love to see, and I understand that is very difficult, is a more holistic transformation of how MVPs are translated into a fieldable technology. And that means no longer relying on bigger contractors. So something that is more holistically changing about the procurement process. But I know we're all hoping for that, and I'm not going to be like, yeah, let's do that. So that is a problem. But without changing that, I just don't see this problem going away, because getting investment from bigger companies might be a Band-Aid solution, is a good Band-Aid solution, but it's not a permanent solution. So that kind of, when I saw that issue, I kind of asked myself, what is causing the frozen middle to not give out money to MVPs. Because for example, I'm at an MVP stage, so I asked the question, why am I getting nowhere with, say, soft ATNL or some PEO? And that kind of goes back to what brings an MVP to a fieldable solution in the battle space. So that process is different in the military space than in, say, Google or a commercial space, right? Because the cost of bringing a prototype to the battle space is a lot higher in the DoD compared to commercial. And so, like, if I were a program manager giving out $3 million, I'm going to think, if I invest in this and it fails in the battle space, is it going to come back and bite me in the ass? Can I say that? So I'm already toning the feelable thing very, like, I'm toning my rangy talk down. So then it kind of goes back to the culture problem that we were talking about before, which is as an engineer or as a soldier who's coming up with a solution that is an MVP, how do I talk to the program manager so that I can convince him that I'm not going to kill anybody with my technology? And that goes to AI, software, hardware system, anything at all. So that's kind of how I see bridging the gap between commercial and government, which is really a common language problem again. But yeah.
So I'm going to add my 2 cents to that. I actually think that what we've done with a lot of our SBIRs and our OTAs has been good progress, but we go to the customer without educating the customer on who they need to work with within the broader Department of Defense to make that MVP scalable. And if you're at a squadron or if you're at a battalion or something and somebody comes to you with a capability, they say, yes, I want to prototype this. Yes, I want to use it. Yes, I want to use the SBIR money to help me put my capability out there. But when that period of performance is over, that squadron commander, that battalion commander has no idea how to get it into the broader system. They don't know who the program managers are. They don't know who the contracting officers are. They don't even understand it. So I think that the valley of death is being bridged between the private sector and the national security space, but the valley of death that we have that exists is within our own organizations of not knowing, and it goes back to Jeremiah's talk today of the 25 levels of bureaucracy, that lowest level has no idea to get to the right level of bureaucracy and to whom.
I'm going to go ahead and super agree with you on that because I actually experienced that from the commercial side. So.
Well, then let's be pragmatic about it. Then drive down the technological barriers to entry so that users can use it. I mean, this is not complex. The reason that you get feedback from users and you can work with the software and technology is because it's deployable. So it's the fault of us, it's the fault of others. We shouldn't have to figure out how to hack the bureaucracy when otherwise the right hack is live on the systems in which people develop the software we're talking about right now. So what seem like tactical choices today, like do we have an authority to operate for Kubernetes or Docker or TensorFlow, or do we use AutoML or whatever that is? These are strategic decisions for tomorrow. So I think that's the first step to addressing both sides of the equation.
Yeah, one of the things we're doing in the Air Force with MIT, we started something called the Air Force AI Accelerator at MIT. I'm sure that's a mouthful. We'll come up with a cool Star Wars name eventually. The projects that we have with researchers, we found 10 airmen that are either there or heading there, and they are embedded with an MIT research team. We went through the process this summer of going through the MIT professors submitted 160 ideas, and we whittled those down to 10. So we're going to start with 10 projects. They're going to be things like AI for weather where you have no data, right? Where places we fly, for example, AI to understand the effects of stress on human performance, AI to help pilots or student pilots, and eventually, get to a point where you have R2-D2 in a cockpit, right? So there's my Star Wars reference for the day. So there's a bunch of other things, but the point of those projects isn't to build a thing and then try to plug it in. The point of those projects is to create the conditions for a challenge or competition, that we will go out to a broad array of solution providers to include small businesses. And this is all Dr. Roper's, essentially his mandate, which was I want to be able to spin off new businesses and or expand the industrial base based on the projects that we're doing there at MIT. We picked the projects based on the stakeholder involvement, in other words, the program offices who demonstrated they're going to have skin in the game. So we're trying to build the bridge the valley of death, simultaneous to trying to, start these projects at the beginning.
So I'd like to turn it back to Sam and Elsa. So human interaction and teaming is something that we consider very important in the defense entrepreneur space. And I'm curious as to what your opinions or thoughts are on how the Chinese and the Russians are looking at human-machine teaming. And then we're going to talk about this from the US perspective.
Go ahead.
Russians are studying man-on-man teaming, or MUM-T, extensively. I think a lot of that study took place by watching what the United States is doing so that they can either avoid the mistakes already made or leapfrog the existing research. That is something of great interest to the MOD. We've seen the Ministry of Defense of Russia, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, always talk about advanced weapons, new weapons, innovation, AI, in the context of what the future war will hold. And for the Russian defense and industry, the future war is basically born in Syria. So they saw in Syria the contours of future conflict, unmanned systems, automated control systems, and how all of that is tied together. There's a lot of research happening. Some of that is classified, but from the open sources, we can tell that the Russians are looking at the United States, they're looking at what the Chinese are developing, they're looking at what the Europeans are developing, and they're trying to see if that could be adopted to their force structure. There's a lot that has to happen before humans and machines can work together, but I think we have to give credit, or enough credit, to the Russians that they're trying to work through that problem set. Again, I've mentioned earlier, there's a lot of innovation experimentation taking place, and it's taking place across the entire Russian MOD structure.
And unsurprisingly, the Chinese military is also interested in these notions of human-machine coordination or integration, looking quite closely at US concepts and our approaches. So for instance, the notion of having a human in the loop relative to on the loop or out of the loop is part of the conversation among Chinese military academics. There have been some predictions or expectations that as a military, under conditions of authoritarianism, China may be more willing to take humans out of the loop. I don't think there's robust evidence for that at this point, and the distinction that I would make is that it does appear the PLA appreciates the importance of the human element in an era of what is often described as intelligentized warfare, a process in which the character of conflict is being transformed by the advent of artificial intelligence. And I think there is a recognition that this does create new challenges for humans and new importance for training as well. I think this is honestly something that the Chinese military, like the Russian military, like the US military, is still figuring out and very much experimenting with. I've seen some interesting allusions and writings to notions of brain control or the potential of brain-computer interfaces as a mechanism for enhanced command and control, so very simple BCIs through which someone can operate a small drone. This is at least at a developmental and experimental stage. I've seen some speculation that future command and control could enable or could involve deeper integration between humans and machines. A lot of talk as well about human-machine hybrid intelligence. Lieutenant General Liu Guozhe, who's the head of the CMC S&T Commission, has said that hybrid intelligence will be the highest form of future intelligence, and this notion that trying to achieve the synergy between the best attributes of human and machine intelligence is seen as of critical importance. I think the question will be, can the Chinese military overcome their own challenges of human capital as well as their cultural difficulties in enabling the trust and learning, especially as a military that lacks contemporary experience in combat. So I often describe this what the Chinese military is attempting to do as learning without fighting, which is why they're looking very closely at lessons learned from Russia and Syria or from American initiatives. And I think it remains to be seen whether wargaming, simulations, and experimentation with, for instance, virtual reality and training, and a lot of what is described as under the umbrella of actual combat training can compensate for that lack of practical experience.
And I'd like to add that on one hand, the Russians are saying that human will always be in the loop when it comes to AI and robotics. How that will actually happen downrange when the soldier can be overwhelmed with all kinds of data remains to be seen. And on the other hand, they're saying there's going to be a gradual decrease in the role of a human soldier or operator in combat downrange. So on one hand, they want to keep human in the loop. On the other hand, they want to have more automated processes in place for future wars.
I think there's a sense of inevitability that the tempo and complexity of operations is increasing. That will necessitate greater machine involvement. And I think the degree, extent, and character of human involvement will depend upon the level and the application. So tactical, campaign, strategic, and very different from when you're talking about cyber operations relative to swarming or autonomous weapons.
So from a US perspective, how should we address human-machine teaming and human interaction? And I'd like you to add to that what you think the deaf community can help in that respect, if you know.
So one of the things you saw from Greg Allen yesterday, a picture of our Fireline model that we have a great company startup in San Francisco helping us with, and they're doing amazing work. The point there is ultimately to reduce the time associated with search and discovery and resource allocation decisions, and then ultimately the actual operations themselves. So it's really, when it comes to human-machine teaming, I think, kind of step one is find ways that results in moving faster. I mean, ultimately competition, whether it's against a wildfire or competition against, somebody on a battlefield, or it's about speed, right? So it's the OODA loop, it's John Boyd, it really comes down to that. There are small things that we can do to reduce those speeds associated with those three main functions, really, of any military operation: search and discovery, resource allocation, and the actual execution of operations. So there's many small things we can do. We don't have to jump right to lethal autonomous weapons. We don't have to, jump right to a lot of, command and control that's automated and decisions are made, but it's about making those things faster, right? What can the deaf community do? I think step one is education, right? There are so many folks who just don't have this literacy or this language or this understanding. They hear AI, they don't really understand necessarily what that means. I think that's step one, and I'm sure others will have other ideas along that. But I struggle, and Mike and I do this all the time, right? We're constantly just trying to explain very basic things, and not just about AI, but the underlying tech, the underlying aspects of AI as it relates to software and education and digital talent.
Yeah, I'm going to largely agree with that. I was going to go down the OODA route, but we were speaking about that earlier. But the OODA loop, where is AI good at things? Machine learning in its essence right now? Observe and orient. Just use observe and orient. We should focus on that, and then let the human have more time and space as an expert to take that decide and act portion. Nothing is characteristically changing here. And as for the conversations that we need to have, I think as the Department of Defense, over the course of the past 1.5 years, since about mid-2017, we have been conspicuously absent from a really important conversation as AI came to bear. Right now, there are ethics summits happening in China and Russia. And we haven't been a part of these things right now, and we weren't talking about it. So I would implore anybody to communicate about our values, the way we think about these technologies, and what we'd like to do with them, because that's going to be what wins the day, a different value proposition than going some other route than how we view the world.
Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add?
I can talk about HCI a little bit. Obviously, human-computer interactions, it depends on the mission space, it depends on the operator, it depends on the soldier, it depends on what he is doing, what kind of effects that he's trying to create, what kind of technology that he's using. Once again, there's a lot of good work on ML and AI, or narrow AI, in the field that are more specific to a certain application. But overall, we are eventually going to get to a point where we have so many of these human-computer interaction technology that we have to kind of put them all together and decide what should be used in what case strategically. So we can kind of get into the science of that a little more if you want to nerd out with me. But in terms of what dev community can do, there's a lot. Again, artificial intelligence is intelligence. But the trick to this whole thing is not Like what distinguish a purely chaotic environment to a disciplined chaotic environment that we can harness power from is that, a community can just talk about ideas all the time versus we can talk about ideas in a way that explains to other people why we think a certain thing. So for example, if we think that a certain technology can aid us in doing a certain battle space action, why do you think that? Expose your reasoning so that other people can criticize you and we can all grow better. And that, I think I've learned a lot from a lot of people from DEF community. I know there's a lot of tactical people, operational people, strategic people, and they all have great ideas. And I think it'd be great for all of us to come together to share their ideas and expose the logic behind our ideas. So.
And I just add that I worry a lot about risks and safety, especially when we're thinking about these complex human-machine interactions and a very competitive ecosystem. And I think one thing that's going to be critical going forward is to continue to mature and advance that conversation about AI safety or security. A Chinese research institute put out a whole white paper on AI security that actually had a fairly sophisticated framework for thinking about the range of risks that could come into play, whether that's the security of data or potential manipulation of algorithms. And on the flip side, I've also seen some Chinese military academics write about how, as a weaker military relative to the US, China should concentrate on options to counter or undermine potential adversary capabilities. So I think the notion of, as all of our militaries continue to explore these opportunities for new capabilities, I think the risks of vulnerabilities that come into play is a reason for great concern, especially when we think about some of the overarching ramifications for the military balance, for strategic stability. And I think one thing that'll be important for the DEF community and for this ecosystem as a whole is really to think adversarially, think about worst case scenarios and think about ways to mitigate those risks to the extent possible, and be Stanislav Petrov, be the one who questions or challenges. Don't always trust the machine. Work on trying to calibrate trust and thinking about how do we have appropriate levels of credulity, but also a tendency to challenge where appropriate. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on those fronts, and also, I hope, ways to engage with potential adversaries and strategic competitors on ways to reduce overall risks, because I think, at the very least, I hope there is general agreement about avoiding an inadvertent escalation in these competitive relationships. And I think thinking about the range of pathways that come into play with these increases in speed, as we've discussed, and these complex interactions will be important.
I just want to add quickly, we cannot underestimate the extent to which countries like Russia and China will go to in order to succeed. Prior to Russian invasion of Syria, or involvement, I should say, in Syria, there was a lot of talk in DC that they will not succeed because they don't have the same tools that United States did, such as sea lift capability, airlift capability. Syria was a quagmire already, and inserting themselves into that civil war would be difficult, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, fast forward to now. Almost all the critics have been proven wrong because Russia used a variety of civilian and military capabilities to succeed in Syria. And I think when it comes to high tech, I think when it comes to AI and machine learning with military applications, we're going to probably see the same pattern emerging as well.
Okay, on that somber note, we're going to do a lightning round to lighten things up, and then we'll take a couple minutes of questions. Okay, so the first one I would like everybody to ask, we're just going to start with Mike and we'll go down the aisle, is what's the best movie that relates to AI, or what's the best Hollywood fallacy about AI?
Her. I really like Her. Great movie. In addition to that, I think that that AI will naturally generate some evil intention state that there's no reason for that. That's not the natural inclination of whatever an artificial intelligence will be. It's not going to, for whatever reason, want to overcome the human. And I think that's a very different viewpoint than we have with other nation states who are excited about the aspect of AI, while alternatively, most of America is afraid of AI.
I'm gonna give a plug to a Russian TV series made for Netflix called Better Than People, or Лучше чем люди. I highly recommend you watch it. And it is a story about an AI-enabled human-like robot that is trying to integrate into the family and the human infrastructure. basically into a family. And there's a lot of checks and balances that were built into that robot that she's unable to overcome and that the people are unable to understand. I think when it comes to our ability to kind of view AI through the Hollywood lens, we tend to think of the Terminator right away. But there's a lot of steps to get there. And I think that TV series made for Netflix actually gets there. So I recommend you watch it. Plus, it's a fairly high budget production. I think American viewers will probably enjoy it. I think the fallacy, again, is we think of AI as a finished product. It will be as smart as people. It will be as smart as a human brain. We don't yet know how to get there technologically, so there's going to be a very long slog to get there.
I agree. I worry more about artificial incompetence than I do about artificial intelligence sometimes. But and speaking of the Terminator, I actually just watched the movies for the first time on my flights, which were rather long. And one thing I actually hadn't realized about the second movie in the series is that there is rather a positive ending, in the sense that the Terminator is reprogrammed and actually does start to learn empathy and learn human slang and whatnot. And I think that does speak to, even though the Terminator is often seen as worst case scenario, terrifying, unceasing, there actually is sort of a message also in those movies about human agency, that we design AI, we decide what the parameters of its mission are, we decide what the attributes we want to have in AI will be, and we do have the ability to control that. And as, speaking of control, I think probably one of my least favorite recent pop culture representations was Star Trek Discovery, not so affectionately known as STD by those who were not a fan of the show. But yes, the whole control plot, and I don't want to spoil it for those who haven't seen it, but sort of this very typical notion of malevolent intelligence that is dedicated to human extermination. And yeah, I was disappointed by that, among many other things about the show, but I'll leave it there for now.
So I also like Her, the movie Her. That was a good movie. I think the fallacy is Battlefield Galactica. Yeah, that's not going to happen. we're so far from being able to do that. We don't even have a clue how to make evil robots. We can barely make robots that walk properly. So artificial intelligence, again, like Elsa said, is something that you have to feed into. And that's kind of more of the thing that I care about, is when we worry about the ethics of AI. We as America, as a country, needs to decide what that ethics is. We need to decide how to feed that AI, because we know that algorithm is going to look very different for Russia and China. And we have to decide how we are going to seed the algorithm to deal with that. So yes, I'm also more worried about AI's incompetence rather than evil robots. But
So I made my kids watch War Games the other day. It's super awesome. I mean, they're like tons of, I mean, it's probably not, I'm not Dad of the Year for doing that, but tons of plot holes. But honestly, AlphaGo, right? The documentary, if you haven't seen it on Netflix. What inspires me by that movie is at the end, when the Go players, these champion Go players, recognize that this algorithm made them better, that they saw things that they didn't see before, that they were able to pierce through their human bias in ways that they hadn't before. This is what inspires me about AI, is that there's an opportunity, if we do it right, that we're going to start to pierce through the biases that result in bad decisions or different decisions, right? Or at least get us to ask questions that we're not asking right now about ourselves and about our decision making. I think, you know, I agree with everything about the fallacies and everything else. I don't think killer robots are inevitable. I think that people get confused about where we're at in a state of AI and machine learning, deep learning, and confuse that with artificial general intelligence, which isn't here yet. I don't think killer robots, if they do exist, will look anything like Arnold Schwarzenegger. They'll probably, you know, be in the cloud or something, right? They won't be something I think you can touch and feel, but I don't think they're inevitable.
Okay, and with that, we have about 5 minutes for questions. Does anybody have a question? So your hand went up first. I'll grab you first.
My big question is on the digital literacy side of this. How are we going about expanding the literature, you know, DoD and the U.S. Platform. I have a high degree of confidence. The guy behind me speaks platform. I don't speak linear algebra. How are we going to fix that so we can start valuing?
Well, as a plug,
Sorry.
there's this thing called the United States Air Force Computer Language Initiative, in which we will value the aptitude and proficiencies of language, like foreign languages, speaking Farsi or something, as the same of speaking Python or anything else like that. And then that will in turn drive this idea that we have to provide them the tools, the reskilling, the education opportunities in order to learn these things. Now, all of these languages too are progressively becoming less constrained. So I think it's becoming more accessible for people as well. And our airmen are smart. They all know how to do this. So the good news is that this is reflected in the 2020 Senate NDAA as it stands right now, the draft, and hopefully we'll take this to the next level for the entirety of the federal government.
We do have a senior leader challenge in just an understanding that they actually are the ones who own the software, the networks, and all of the responsibility, right? It isn't the A6, G6, et cetera, it's the commander. And so I went and so we have something called the Joint Forces Air Component course, and we have all 4 services there. There are 1 and 2 stars who take that course, and I briefed them on software and data and AI, and just went through terms and concepts and try to emphasize that these are things that you have to understand. And I emphasized the SWAP studies, so the Software Acquisition and Practices study that the Defense Innovation Board put together. I think many of the people in this room, if not most, have read it, and I urge them, please read that. And when you hear things like, ma'am, sir, comms are good, you have to stop and start really peeling that back. And then we had a discussion of, whether my argument was software and data are now the capabilities that matter most, and our advantage comes from our airmen's ability to create, develop, implement software and data at speed and scale. And I would argue that they may even be the weapons that matter most. And then we got in this debate of whether they're weapons or not. And when you present to them, well, is it a weapon if I use software and data to take down the power in your operations center? Is it a weapon at that point, right? So I think the conversations need to happen at that level just to get them curious enough to own it. We're starting to see that. It's going to be, I think, a long period of time before we get them in the, so when we talk about upskilling our workforce and providing that digital literacy, it's throughout the force, all the way up to commanders.
Okay, one more question. Yes.
So I have a question more for Elsa and Sam. Is there a qualitative way that the Russians and the Chinese program different? So it's not just in the application of using these specific algorithms. Do they look at how they're asking the data to do things in a different way?
That's a great question. And I suppose I would say I don't have great visibility at that level of granularity as to coding. I would defer to those with more technical expertise in those fronts. But generally speaking, I do think AI that is developed in China or Russia will be different on the basis of the data that is available, on the basis of the priorities and concerns, as well as the organizations that are involved in developing it. And say at the strategic level, for instance, China has concentrated quite extensively on brain-inspired approaches to artificial intelligence, leveraging some intersections between neuroscience as a way of inspiring different architectures. That may be distinctive, and that may or may not be a viable paradigm going forward. I'd say to some degree, the Chinese military's approach to AI, including the applications they prioritize, will be informed by the particular challenges and characteristics of their force. So, for instance, Chinese military leaders have bemoaned the fact that they don't believe that some officers are capable of judging the situation or coming up with effective decisions. So using AI and decision support, actually inspired by AlphaGo, appears to be a major emphasis in some of these initiatives, and looking at trying to compensate for weaknesses or targeting particular vulnerabilities in their way of warfighting, and seeing ways to use technology to augment that. So I think also thinking asymmetrically in some cases, seeing themselves as a weaker military, that may also influence applications. But in terms of the specific technical features, I think that's, my research is always ongoing, and definitely I think those of us who are trying to track this all, again, at the open source level, is a lot to keep learning about how this is taking shape.
Like Elsa, I don't have a lot of visibility on how Russians code. I know there's a lot of cooperation between a lot of Russian IT companies and computer companies and international companies. I know there's a lot of ingestion and absorption of Western technologies, Western IT concepts, Israeli technologies, and Asian technologies. But again, that is probably an evolving concept as well. On the MOD level, there's a lot of conversation about big data analysis and what that means for many Russian military systems, including electronic warfare. So that's probably a good indication of how they're going to code and where they're going with that.
A computer vision algorithm is a computer vision algorithm. The world has looked at it as a do right that we put this out there publicly. It's what you do with that stuff. They will do things that we are not willing to do, and that has been pretty, clear if you look at the Uyghurs in China, or you look at how Russia puts computer vision on their tanks, right? So I think that understanding that this is publicly available, it's what you do with it, is a real concern. A deep fake is great for detecting cancer. It also creates fake news.
Okay, on that, if everybody could give a big warm round of applause to our panel today. And we are now moving on to the roundup for the conference. 5-minute break. Please come back in. Please don't make us corral you. 5 minutes.